Turtle Mountain, Dakota Territory. October, 1873. The autumn air was sharp, a brittle promise of the winter to come. Most men were chinking walls, banking sod against their cabins, or splitting the last of their wood into stove-sized lengths. Eero Halonen was digging a hole, not a well, not a root cellar, but a precise 12 by 12-foot square depression in the prairie, right beside his small, inadequate cabin. He worked with a quiet economy of motion, his shovel slicing into the black earth, piling the soil neatly around the edges of the pit. He was a man of medium height and build, with a face that seemed shaped by weather and silence. His neighbors watched. They leaned on their axe handles and wagon wheels, chewing on slivers of wood, their expressions a mixture of pity and contempt. This was the third strange project the Finn had undertaken since his arrival, and by far the most bizarre. Amos Bell, the Homestead supplier and a man whose opinion carried the weight of goods on credit, rode his horse over from the settlement. He was a big, practical man who understood lumber, nails, and the brutal arithmetic of a Dakota winter. He reined in his horse, looking down into the 3-foot-deep pit Eero was now leveling. "Halonen," Bell called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of a creditor. "What in God's name are you doing?" Other settlers, Jedediah Morse and Silas Croft among them, drifted closer, eager for the explanation. Eero paused, resting one foot on his shovel. He looked up, his eyes a pale, steady blue. "Making a place for winter," he said. His English was spare, each word an effort. Bell let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A place? That's a grave you're digging. You can't live in a hole in the ground. It's unlivable, man. Damp, cold. You'll bury your family alive." Silas Croft, a farmer who'd lost 2 calves to a spring blizzard, shook his head. "It's foolishness. Plain foolishness. A man fights the winter standing up, not lying down in the dirt like a badger." The consensus settled over the small gathering like an early frost. The Finn, the quiet man from a country no one could find on a map, was not just strange. He was crazy. He was digging a tomb for his wife and 2 small children, and there wasn't a soul on Turtle Mountain who could talk him out of it. What did this Finnish peat cutter understand about convection, about the raw, heat-stripping power of wind, that the experienced, practical homesteaders of Dakota Territory had missed? What secret was held in the memory of his hands? A knowledge of earth and fiber that seemed like madness to men who only trusted in logs and iron. If you follow this story of quiet defiance, I promise you will learn the fundamental principle of wind-driven heat loss that separates mere survival from genuine safety. It is a principle of physics as relevant today as it was in 1873. To support our exploration of these forgotten histories, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. We read everyone. Eero Halonen was not a carpenter. He had none of the intuitive feel for timber and joinery that marked the best frontier builders. He was not a farmer in the Dakota sense, accustomed to the vast, open geometries of plowed land. He was, by trade and by soul, a peat cutter from the windswept bogs of Kainuu, Finland. His entire life had been spent working with the skin of the earth itself. He understood the insulating properties of sphagnum moss, the wind-stopping density of packed sod, the subtle warmth that lingered deep in the soil long after the air had turned to iron. His hands knew the heft of the earth, the fibrous tear of turf, the way a well-cut block of peat could be shaped into a wall that held back a gale. He had come to America with his wife, Aino, and their 2 children, Mikael and Sophia, chasing the promise of land. But the Dakota Territory was not the sheltered, forested landscape of his home. It was an ocean of grass, ruled by a sky of infinite size and a wind of infinite power. Their first winter, in 1872, had been a lesson in that power. They had a standard homesteader's cabin, hastily built with green cottonwood logs. It was a sieve. The chinking, a mixture of mud and grass, cracked and fell out. The single-pane window grew a thick, opaque layer of interior frost that never melted. The lessons were brutal and specific. Eero would never forget waking to find the water pail skimmed with a half-inch of ice by dawn, even with the stove still warm. He remembered the sickening way the smoke would puff back down the flue. Driven by a wind that created a pressure differential too strong for the draft. Most of all, he remembered the children's boots, left by the fire, but still frozen stiff in the morning. Aino would have to warm them with her own hands before Mikael and Sophia could put them on. They had survived, but it was a shivering, miserable, smoke-filled existence, a constant battle that consumed a mountain of wood and yielded only a cramped circle of bare survivability around the stove. Eero watched his family huddle in blankets, their breath pluming in the cabin air, and a quiet, cold resolve formed in his heart. He had failed them. His ignorance of this new land's specific cruelties had put them at risk. Never again. He spent the rest of that winter not just surviving, but observing. He watched how the snow drifted, noting the patterns the wind carved. He saw how it scoured the north-facing walls of his cabin, leaving them bare and black while piling deep, insulating drifts on the leeward southern side. He saw how the wild animals survived, the fox in its den, the badger in its burrow. They did not build fortresses to fight the wind. They simply got out of its way. The problem, he realized, wasn't the cold. The Dakota Territory was cold. That was a fact like gravity. The problem was the wind. The wind was a thief, a relentless engine that stole heat faster than any fire could possibly create it. His Finnish experience with peat and sod wasn't about building. It was about insulating, about stopping the movement of air. Here, the challenge was the same, but the scale was immense. He couldn't build a forest to block the wind, so he would have to use the earth itself. The conventional failure of the homestead cabins around him was a tragedy of physics, repeated across the plains. Amos Bell sold the materials for these failures, and men like Jedediah Morse and Silas Croft built them with pride. They used the best logs they could find, squared them neatly, and packed the gaps. They installed expensive cast-iron stoves capable of throwing off thousands of BTUs of heat, and yet their families still shivered. The enemy was convection, specifically forced convection, driven by the incessant Dakota wind. A log wall, no matter how well chinked, was full of tiny imperfections. Cold, dense, sub-zero air was forced through these cracks by the pressure of the wind, a process called infiltration. Every cubic foot of warm, buoyant air that leaked out of the cabin's roof was replaced by a cubic foot of Arctic air that had to be heated from scratch. Their stoves were not just heating their cabins, they were attempting to heat the entire northern plains. It was a battle they were doomed to lose. The very surfaces of their cabins betrayed them. A 20-mile-per-hour wind at 0 degrees Fahrenheit has the same effect on a surface as a temperature of minus 24 degrees in calm air. The wind was constantly scrubbing the warmth from the exterior of the logs, pulling the heat right through the wood. Inside, the family felt this as a constant, radiating cold coming from the walls themselves, even if the air in the center of the room was warm. Jedediah Morse burned through 10 cords of wood that first winter. He spent most of his waking hours felling, bucking, splitting, and hauling. His reward was a home where his wife's bread dough wouldn't rise unless it was placed directly on the hearth, and his children slept in their coats. Silas Croft's cabin was worse. Built in a slight depression, the wind seemed to swirl around it, pressurizing every side at once. Smoke constantly backed up his chimney, filling the single room with acrid haze that made his infant daughter cough through the night. These men weren't foolish. They were competent, hardworking, and building according to the best practices they knew. Their methods had worked in the more sheltered, less extreme climates of Ohio or Missouri. But here, on the open prairie, the rules had changed. The wind was a dominant physical force they had not accounted for. They diagnosed the problem as a need for bigger fires, and so they burned more wood. Eero Halonen saw it differently. The problem wasn't the fire. The problem was the sieve. And so he began to build his solution, one shovelful of dirt at a time. The construction of what the settlers called Halonen's Folly was a public spectacle throughout that October. After digging the 12 by 12-foot pit 3 feet deep, he used the excavated sod and soil to build up the walls another 2 feet, creating a bermed, semi-sunken structure 5 feet deep in total. The walls were not logs or planks. They were the planet Earth, a thermal mass of immense stability. The roof was the next challenge, and the source of his direct conflict with Amos Bell. He needed thick planks to span the 12-foot opening strong enough to bear a heavy load. He went to Bell's supply post with what little cash he had. Bell was behind the counter, tallying a ledger. He didn't look up immediately. "Halonen," he said, his voice flat. "Come to your senses yet?" "I need planks," Eero said. 2-inch thick, 12-foot long. Bell finally put down his pen and looked at him. "For what? To roof that hole? I told you, I can't in good conscience sell lumber for a man to bury his family in. It's not a house. It's a damp, dark pit. It's unlivable. I'm cutting your credit, Eero. I can't have it on my ledger that I helped you do this." The economic blow was sharp and real. Without credit, a homesteader was crippled. Eero's face didn't change. He met Bell's gaze without anger or pleading. He simply reached into his pocket and placed his cash on the counter. "I will buy what I can." He counted out the bills and coins. It was enough for 2/3 of the planks he needed. Bell hesitated, then sighed and took the money. It was business after all. But as Eero loaded the lumber, Bell said, more to himself than to Eero, "I hope to God you know what you're doing, man." Eero's minimal response was quiet, almost a whisper. "The earth is warm," he said, and returned to his work. He laid the planks he could afford across the opening, leaving smaller gaps between them than he would have liked. Over this wooden ceiling he placed a layer of tough prairie sod, grass side down, to create a tight seal. Then came the master stroke, the part of his plan that stemmed directly from his life in the peat bogs. He began to move his entire winter's hay supply, a massive, fragrant stack weighing several tons, onto the roof. For days, he worked with his pitchfork, piling the hay higher and higher until the structure beneath was completely buried under a 10-foot thick, tightly packed cap of insulating fiber. From a distance, it no longer looked like a structure at all. It looked like a haystack sitting in a shallow depression. His wife, Aino, watched with a worried expression. She trusted her husband's hands. But this was beyond anything she had ever known. "It looks like a badger's den, Eero," she said one evening, her voice soft. He paused, leaning on his pitchfork, and gave her a rare, small smile. "Badgers are warm in winter," he replied. "The final, crucial element was the ventilation. A hole in the ground would be a death trap without a supply of fresh air." Eero did not simply cut a hole. He dug a small 10-foot-long tunnel, lining it with sod, that opened into the shelter near the floor. The tunnel's entrance was on the south side of the haystack, away from the prevailing northwesterly winter winds, and was protected by a small hood of stones. This would be his air intake. For an exhaust, he fashioned a small, clay-lined flue for a tiny sheet metal stove, barely bigger than a bucket, which passed up through the planks, sod, and the 10 feet of hay. It was an ingenious system designed to allow for slow, controlled air exchange, not the violent, chaotic infiltration that plagued the log cabins. The physics of Eero's design were both simple and profound, and they centered on defeating convection. The wind is a relentless thief of heat, and a conventional cabin presents it with a massive surface area to plunder. Every square foot of wall is a battlefield where the cabin's precious warmth is pitted against the vast cold of the atmosphere. The wind constantly accelerates this transfer, a process called forced convection. Think of blowing on a spoonful of hot soup. Your breath, the moving air, strips away the heat far faster than if you just let it sit. The Dakota wind was doing the same thing to every cabin on the prairie 24 hours a day. A log wall might have an R value, a measure of its resistance to heat flow, of around 8. The wind effectively reduced that to almost nothing. Eero's shelter systematically dismantled this thieving mechanism. First, by sinking the living space 3 feet into the ground, he removed the majority of his walls from the equation entirely. Below the frost line, the earth maintains a remarkably stable temperature, around 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, no matter how cold the air gets. His walls weren't losing heat to a minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit wind. They were adjacent to 45 degrees Fahrenheit soil. This dramatically reduced the temperature difference and therefore the rate of heat loss through conduction. More importantly, it meant zero exposure to wind, no infiltration, no forced convection. Second, the berms he built with the excavated earth acted like the prow of a ship, deflecting the wind. The wind couldn't hit the structure squarely, it was forced up and over, its velocity creating a pocket of calmer air around the shelter, much like a large rock in a river creates a calm eddy behind it. Third, and most critically, was the hay cap. A 10-foot thick layer of hay is a phenomenal insulator. Its R value is difficult to calculate precisely, but it could be as high as R40 or R50, more than 5 times that of a log wall. But its true genius was in its structure. The millions of individual stalks of hay created an immense porous matrix. The wind could blow across the top of the stack, but it couldn't penetrate it. It broke up the moving air into countless tiny dead air pockets. Dead air is the essence of insulation. By trapping air and stopping it from moving, you stop convective heat loss. Eero had built a 10-foot thick shield of dead air. The controlled ventilation system was the final piece. The cabins of his neighbors were victims of uncontrolled ventilation. They had dozens of cracks and gaps. Eero's shelter had exactly 2 openings, 1 intake and 1 exhaust. This allowed him to control the rate of air exchange. He could let in just enough fresh air for breathing and for the stove to draw while the warm exhaust air was channeled out. He had replaced a chaotic, heat-wasting system with a controlled, efficient one. He wasn't fighting the wind. He had made his home invisible to it. January of 1874 brought the test. It did not come as a gentle snowfall. It came as a ground blizzard. For 2 days, a low-pressure system had scoured the northern plains, and then the wind shifted, coming down from the Arctic like a physical blow. It picked up the loose snow already on the prairie and hurled it sideways with hurricane force. The temperature plunged to 20 below zero, but the wind made it feel like 60 below. Visibility dropped to the length of a man's arm. The world vanished into a screaming horizontal vortex of white. Inside the Morse cabin, the family huddled together. The wind made a sound like a freight train on their northern wall. Fine, dust like snow, sharper than sand, forced its way through the tiniest cracks, forming little drifts on the floorboards and windowsills. They stuffed rags into the gaps. But it was useless. The cold was an invading army. At Amos Bell's homestead, the situation was just as dire. His well-built house, the pride of the settlement, felt like a tattered tent. They had to shout to be heard over the roar of the wind. The heat from their large stove, burning wood at a terrifying rate, seemed to vanish a few feet from its iron sides. Bell stood by the window, peering into the white chaos, a knot of dread in his stomach. He thought of the Halonans. He pictured their foolish hole in the ground filling with snow, the family trapped, freezing in the dark. The thought was a cold weight of guilt. He had sold the man the planks, after all. 10 yards away from Bell's shivering house, yet a world apart, the Halonen family was at peace. The sound of the blizzard, a storm that was tearing other structures apart, was a distant, muffled hum, like a far-off waterfall. Inside their subterranean room, the air was perfectly still. A single small lantern cast a warm, steady glow on the packed earth walls. Aino sat on a low bench, mending one of Mikhail's shirts. The children, Mikhail, now 7, and Sophia, 5, were on the floor, which was covered with a clean canvas tarp over a layer of straw. They were drawing on a slate, their fingers nimble, not stiff with cold. They were in their shirt sleeves. The tiny stove glowed with a soft red light, fed by small handfuls of wood Eero added every hour. The temperature in the shelter held at a steady, comfortable 65 degrees. The true proof of this impossible climate sat on a wooden crate on the far side of the room, a full 10 feet from the stove. It was their tin kettle filled with water they had melted earlier. A tiny, almost invisible wisp of steam still curled from its spout. In a space where water stayed hot away from the fire, the battle against the cold had been won so completely it was no longer a battle at all. It was simply life. The ground blizzard raged for a full 36 hours. When the wind finally subsided, the sun rose on a transformed world. The landscape was an alien vista of white waves, sculpted by the wind into massive drifts that buried fences, outbuildings, and entire wagons. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the air was utterly still and savagely cold. Amos Bell's first task was to dig his way out of his own home. A 10-foot drift had sealed his front door. He and his eldest son had to climb out a window and work for 2 hours with their shovels just to clear an exit. The snow was packed as hard as cement. Exhausted and chilled to the bone, Bell's thoughts turned immediately to his neighbors. The Morses were a quarter-mile east, the Crofts a half-mile south, and the Halonens, their haystack was somewhere to the north. If it hadn't been blown away entirely. He feared the worst. He imagined the family suffocated or frozen in their earthen grave. He gathered a small rescue party. Jedediah Morse had managed to dig out as well, and they started towards the Halonen claim, moving slowly through the massive drifts. As they got closer to where Bell remembered the haystack being, he saw nothing. Just a vast, rolling expanse of white. His heart sank. They were gone, buried. Then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Morse heard it too. What is that? It was the sound of a shovel. Bell pushed forward, his dread mixed with a flicker of confusion. The sound was coming from the snow itself. Then he saw it. A small, inexplicable column of vapor rising from the top of a huge drift, as if the snow itself were breathing. He floundered closer, his boots sinking deep. The air near the vapor was warm. He reached the spot and looked down a narrow shaft. It was the top of Halonen's chimney. The scraping sound was louder now, coming from just over the crest of the drift. He scrambled to the top and looked down. There was Eero Halonen, calmly shoveling a path from a low, dark opening at the base of the drift. He was not frantic, not desperate. He was not digging for his life. He was clearing his walkway, as if it were any other morning. He wore a simple wool coat, unbuttoned. Bell slid down the drift, his legs weak with relief and disbelief. "Halonen, you're alive!" Eero looked up and nodded. "The storm is over." Amos Bell stood at the entrance to the dugout, panting, his beard a solid mass of ice from his own frozen breath. He braced himself for what he would find inside, expecting a damp, smoky, miserable hovel. He expected to be hit by a wall of cold, fetid air. Instead, as he stepped through the low doorway, a wave of calm, dry, absolutely still warmth washed over his face. It was not the scorching, temporary heat of a roaring stove, but a deep, pervasive warmth that seemed to emanate from the very earth. The air didn't move. His beard, caked with ice, began to prickle and then melt, dripping onto the front of his coat. His eyes adjusted to the lantern light. He saw the two children, looking up at him with placid curiosity. He saw Ino, who offered him a quiet nod. The air smelled faintly of hay, earth, and wood smoke, a clean and pleasant combination. Then his gaze fell upon the detail that shattered his entire understanding of winter. On a bench, far from the stove, sat the tin kettle. A delicate plume of steam was still rising from its spout. A kettle not on the fire was still hot. It was an impossibility that was happening right in front of him. In his own home, a kettle left a foot from his raging stove would have been cold in minutes. He looked from the kettle to the children in their shirt sleeves, from the tiny stove to the calm, warm air. He looked at Eero Halonen, who stood waiting with a quiet patience that was neither proud nor boastful. Bell understood. He had been so profoundly, fundamentally wrong. He had mocked this man for digging a grave, while he had nearly frozen in his own expertly built, expensive, and completely flawed house. Amos Bell, the practical man of lumber and iron, the respected supplier, felt the rigid certainty of his world dissolve into awe. He took a slow breath of the impossible, warm air. "You didn't build a shelter, Halonen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You built a harbor." The conversion of Amos Bell was total and immediate. He became Eero Halonen's most fervent advocate. He told the story in his store. He told the story at the church to every homesteader who came in for supplies. He described the melting ice in his beard and the steaming kettle. He didn't just restore Eero's credit. He extended him an unlimited line, pressing him to take what he needed. But the true spread of the idea came not from talk, but from action. That spring, the local church committee, responsible for community welfare, met to discuss how to prevent the near disasters of the previous winter. Amos Bell stood up and proposed a radical idea. They should not try to improve the cabins. Instead, they should build dedicated storm shelters based on Halonen's design. He called them Haystack cellars. The church crews, organized and efficient, took up the project. They worked with Eero, who freely shared his knowledge, never asking for a thing in return. He showed them how to site the shelters, how to dig the tunnel away from the wind, how to pack the sod. They built the first one next to the church itself, a refuge for those caught in town by a sudden storm. Then they started building them near the most isolated homesteads, small bastions of safety against the winter's rage. By the first snow of 1874, there were 6 Halonen shelters in the Turtle Mountain region. By the following spring, there were more than a dozen. The technique spread not as a primary dwelling, but as a form of life insurance, a community's humble admission that the Finnish peat cutter had understood the wind better than they did. Eero Halonen, with nothing more than a shovel, his hands, and the memory of a different landscape, had engineered a solution that anticipated the most advanced principles of modern building science by a century. His semi-sunken shelter was a precursor to modern earth-sheltered construction. His focus on eliminating uncontrolled air infiltration is the very core of today's passive house standards, which use airtight building envelopes to achieve incredible energy efficiency. He was practicing the science of the building envelope before the term had ever been invented. The story of the Haystack shelter is a powerful lesson in the nature of problems. The settlers of Turtle Mountain believed their problem was the cold, and their solution was to make a bigger fire. They were focused on the source of the heat. They poured their energy, their money, and their backbreaking labor into feeding the stove, the visible symbol of warmth. Eero Halonen understood the real problem was not the cold, it was the wind. The true enemy was the invisible thief that made all their efforts futile.